This is one of the great natural wonders of the world.
And yet, at core, it's not natural.
There's a huge man-made block, on the river, and it's definitely changed the river.
The amount of water is completely up to us.
We have to manage nature. Yeah, we live in a world where we actually manage nature.
This is one of the great natural wonders of the world.
And yet, at core, it's not natural.
There's a huge man-made block, on the river, and it's definitely changed the river.
The amount of water is completely up to us.
We have to manage nature. Yeah, we live in a world where we actually manage nature.
Good evening. I'm Maria Polletta, state politics reporter with the Arizona Republic and azcentral.com. Tonight, we turn our attention back to the governor's race, in which Republican incumbent Doug Ducey will face off against Democratic challenger David Garcia. Last month, we invited both candidates to participate in a debate on a day of their choosing. Only Dr. Garcia agreed to participate. The candidates both later accepted invitations for 30-minute one-on-one interviews. We spoke to Dr. Garcia late last month. Today, we're talking to Governor Ducey about his last 4 years in office and why he believes voters should give him 4 more. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. We appreciate it. I know we're getting down to the wire with last-minute election work and everything these last 2 weeks, so we really appreciate it. Looking back at your first term, let's start with where you feel that you've made the most impact. Which accomplishment, looking back at the last almost 4 years, are you most proud of?
Well, it's hard to pick one accomplishment because I think when I came into office, the state was a much different state than it is today. If you remember, our budget was broken. We had a $1 billion budget deficit. On top of that, our education system was mired in lawsuits, and our economy was flat. And if you fast forward to today, our budget is no longer broken, our budget's balanced, and we have a surplus in the general fund. It is at a record level. Those lawsuits are way behind us, and our economy is booming. So it was a focus on, I think the first issue was tightening the belt, just like Arizona families and businesses have to do, and then bringing a business-like approach. And now our state is growing. We've got a lot of momentum, and that's why I see such opportunity in the next 4 years.
So sort of that stability, financial stability, getting us back on track overall.
Well, I think that was job one. What I would say, if there's something that I'm most proud of, it's what we've been able to do in restoring funding to K-12 education. There's $2.7 billion additional dollars than the day that I came into office. We were able to pass Proposition 123, extend Proposition 301, create the Teachers Academy, and in this last legislative session, we were able to move forward a 20% pay increase for Arizona's teachers. Those teachers had earned and deserved that pay increase, and because we had balanced our budget and we have a booming economy, we were able to get those dollars to our teachers.
Now, I know that your teacher raise plan, education funding plan, they rely on rosy economic projections, which we of course have seen and hope that that continues. What's the backup plan that you have if those projections don't pan out?
Well, the first thing I want to say is they do not rely on rosy economic plans. We have those dollars in our general fund today. Maricopa County is the fastest growing county in the country. We have 260,000 new private sector jobs in the state of Arizona than we did just 3+ years ago. We have 300 companies that have relocated here. We have 200,000 people that have moved to the state. That's grown our tax base. So we have those dollars in the general fund, and the general fund is the most reliable fund for our teachers and for education. A lot of times when people say a dedicated funding source, like my opponent is so fond of saying, that's really a code word for a tax increase. And if you remember when Prop 301 was first passed 20 years ago, that was a sales tax increase for teacher pay. When sales tax collections slowed, the dollars weren't there. We have those dollars in our general fund, and furthermore, Maria, the dollars for teacher pay increases have been advanced appropriated. So that those teachers are getting those dollars. If there were to be a downturn, well, we would have to look somewhere else to find those monies. The good news is, even with this record amount in our general fund today, We have $458 million in a rainy day fund, and I know you reported on the last Finance Advisory Committee. They show $900 million additional dollars in that general fund next year over and above what was budgeted. So we're in a terrific financial situation, not only to secure Arizona's future economically, but from an education standpoint to make our schools safer and also to protect our border.
You mentioned dedicated funding sources, taxes. I know you made several pledges when you were running in 2014. Several of those you have followed through on, but getting the income tax as close to zero as possible is not one of them. I know you've said that that would take 2 terms, but if you were to be reelected, what does that look like? What are the next concrete steps for that goal?
So I think when you run for office, you have aspirational goals, and I look at Arizona as the best place in the country to live, but I know we have room for improvement. So I think you want to have not only a quality of life, but economic attractiveness. And governors are in competitive situation with other governors and with other states. So if you look at a place like Nevada, it has 0 income tax. If you look at a place like Texas, it has 0 income tax. And Utah and Colorado are competitive to Arizona. So when I came into office, I was in a straitjacket. When we didn't have any money and we had that deficit, we certainly couldn't make the tax cuts that I wanted to do, although we did simplify and lower taxes the years that I was in office. Now we have an opportunity for tax reform. I want Arizona to continue to be a wonderful place to live that can attract people and allow you to scale a business. When we have these additional dollars, it allows us to look at our income tax code, our sales tax code, and our property tax code and say, is there a better way to do this that can bring additional revenue into our general fund without raising taxes, but through a reform and improvement of the code?
So going forward, that would be something that you would look at sort of year to year as you have during your first term and see where you might be able to, you know, pull from, or what circumstances would allow you to make those cuts?
Certainly. I want to say that I believe that a lower income tax is better. When you tax something, you get less of it. I want Arizonans to have more income tax rather than less. But I think if you look at that proper combination of the income tax, the sales tax, and the property tax, you have a lot of opportunity, especially in a fast-growing state, to make those improvements so that you have more money for K-12 education. It's more dependable and reliable, but you also have a state where people are going to continue to move to, and first and foremost, I want to take care of the citizens that are here right now and make sure that they're able to climb the economic ladder as well.
Your campaign, to that end, often returns to this idea of opportunity for all. What specifically are you doing, or would you do, to assist everyday Arizonans who feel like they haven't really benefited from that overall economic growth that we've seen as a state?
Well, I'd like to meet those Arizonans that don't believe that they've benefited from the growth in our economy. I mean, today we have more jobs available than we have people to fill them in the state of Arizona. So our economy is no longer flat. People are climbing the economic ladder. Paychecks in Arizona are the 3rd fastest growing paychecks in the nation. We're among the fastest growing states in the nation. What I want to make sure is people understand that this growth is good, it's a gift, but we want it to be responsible growth. And with that growth comes pressing infrastructure needs, of course needs on K-12 education when you have families moving here. We're in the business right now of building schools. You were able to see earlier this week that we're also in the business of reducing recidivism inside our prison system. So, you know, my mom was a waitress, my father was a cop. I believe there's dignity in all work. So whether we're talking about entry-level employment or the employment we see with providers like Benchmark Electronics and software engineering opportunities that we have here, with what Michael Crow's doing at the Fulton School of Engineering, taking it from 7,000 spots to nearly 20 spots, and the businesses that we're winning not only from California but from Texas that are moving to Arizona. That's a real sign we're on the right track. We've got a lot of momentum. That's why I want to put up my record of accomplishment and achievement. And you know, in a campaign, it's about choices. My opponent has a very different plan. He would like to double income taxes in the state of Arizona. I believe that would be the equivalent of hanging out a sign that says Arizona is no longer open for business. I can tell you that the 300 companies that have moved here or expanded here would have never come here if our income taxes were doubled in the state of Arizona. So it's not only our employers and business owners that are benefiting, it's also their employees who are getting pay raises and getting better benefits. That's part of a virtuous economic cycle.
How about rural Arizonans in particular? I know that has been a focus of some of your campaign stops. What are you hearing from them in terms of their needs and some of these situations where, yes, we may have the jobs, but there's sort of a mismatch between qualifications or experience and those jobs that are opening up?
Yes, great question, and there is a contrast there. We have Maricopa County that is booming. We finally have Pima County that's doing as good as it's been doing in the last 6 years with the lowest possible unemployment. But when you go to our rural areas, we've needed to focus there with a different strategy. And we've had some successes, Dot Foods in Mojave County, Signs Plus in Yavapai County. We focused a lot on our relationship with Mexico, and that really has been the artery, being our #1 trading partner, and it's not even close, ×4, to pump energy into southern Arizona. So we're using the Arizona assets map. These are shovel-ready jobs that we can bring into our rural areas, along with the opportunity zones that are a result of the recent federal tax reform that is benefiting Arizona and will specifically benefit our rural areas. So I do think that economic growth is going to begin in the urban core. We have that now. Now I want to focus on the other 13 counties in our state outside of Maricopa and Pima that need that as well.
For those Arizonans who may be lower income, at the very low end there, the state has a reputation for being one of the most strict or stringent in terms of social service or welfare benefits. I know TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, has a 2-year lifetime limit, even though federal allows for 5. Do you think eligible Arizonans should be able to receive state benefits for longer? What are your thoughts on that currently?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, part of the reason that I worked so hard to tighten the belt of state government in my first year is that I believe in a state like Arizona, in a country like America, that we should have a social safety net for our most vulnerable. And it's when you don't balance your budget, when you have spending that's out of control, it's really the people that need it the most that get left behind. So we're going to provide a social safety net in the state of Arizona, but I think the best social program we can provide someone is a job, and a job that can turn into a fulfilling career. And that's why I say when we're in a position today where we have more jobs available than we have people in the state to fill them, that's a good spot to be. I want to move people off those assistance roles and into jobs.
So do you think that, I know you said that that should be available and possibly for a longer amount of time, but do you think the current 2-year, just to clarify, limit strikes the right balance between offering those benefits and, I guess, pushing someone toward a job if possible?
Well, what we want to do is make sure that we have the incentives aligned properly so that we reward work, but we also want someone who is down on their luck or for whatever reason recovering from addiction or whatever situation they're in to have that on-ramp into the economy. So we have looked at this at a year-by-year basis and adjusted as we've gone. And the idea is we've got a unemployment rate that's falling. We've got a labor participation rate that's gaining. Even in the state of Arizona today, we have 130,000 plus individuals that are still on unemployment, and that's due to our federal government's policy, which I believe is failing. It's actually paying people to stay home and not work, and that's something I'd like to work with the federal administration so that we have stewardship over those dollars, and we can work with employers and community colleges and career and technical education outlets so that we can find these people the skills so that they can go back into the workforce.
Going back to education, public education, K through 12 briefly, you've been criticized a bit for being late to the party on calling for charter reform. What flipped the switch to make you support those reforms more recently?
Well, I think those are my opponents that are saying that I'm late to the party. We've been dealing with education and improvement and funding every year that I've been in office. But when you talk about reform, I don't know that there's any part of government that isn't in need of further reform, or that is in a position where you could say, hey, that's perfect right now, and we're not going to move it any further in the right direction. Our charters have been a real blessing to the state of Arizona. Arizona leads the nation in school choice. We have 500 schools of choice in the state of Arizona. They educate nearly 200,000 Arizona children, and those schools are excelling. So my first focus is always going to be about the child inside the classroom, and I want to see them have the results and the outcomes that will allow them to pursue happiness in this country. And that means 4th grade and 8th grade math, reading, and science. That means high school completion, and that means a life either on to university and college, or into a vocational career, or on to the military. But when I see some of these troubling things that have happened, and some of these are rather new or happened in this last year in my watch, and I think it's important people remember our charters, Arizona's been a pioneer. And although they came to life in the 90s, they're still very much in their infancy in Arizona. So I believe that I want to have one set of rules for our school systems, but I don't want to have a over-regulation or do something that's reactive to one bad actor that hurts the results and outcomes that we're seeing in so many of our public districts and our public charters.
What does that reform look like? And of course, this doesn't have to be the exhaustive list, but could you talk about some specifics there? And it could be, you know, we've heard from other candidates, other officials, sort of a mix where you take away some of the oversight or some of the regulations on district schools, but sort of increase that on the charter side with that one set of rules. What does that look like? So
I would provide a Proposition 1, 2, 3 as an example. If you remember, we were in this years-long lawsuit that seemed like unresolvable between the legislative leadership and the education establishment. But we brought some smart people, some leaders from both sides that represented both interests around a table. We built a coalition, and we were able to take something not only through our House and Senate, but to the people for something that solved the problem and allowed us to really stop paying lawyers and start paying teachers. I don't think that the best reforms are done in the election cycle or during a debate or in the last 12 days, but we do have real leaders on the public district side and on the public charter side. And they want much of the same thing. So it's around transparency, accountability, procurement, how the boards are structured, and conflict of interest. And I think if we bring those people to the table with a charge of what we want it to look like, again with a focus on the classroom, what happens to the child, and how do we support the teacher inside that classroom, we'll come up with better reforms that will allow our schools to grow and thrive and not be punitive regulations that punish for no reason.
Moving on to health care, there was a lot of controversy very recently when the state canceled a vaccine education program after receiving some complaints from parents who don't immunize their school-age children were opposed to that program. What's your stance on that public health issue of vaccines?
Well, we're going to vaccinate our kids in the state of Arizona. This is a public health issue. I'm a big believer in freedom and choice on a lot of issues, but we're going to vaccinate our kids. And if your kid's going to be in the public school system in Arizona, they're going to be vaccinated.
I know that you and many other Republicans, of course, oppose Obamacare and sort of the feeling that it overreaches. In terms of the state level, is there a role for the state to play in health care, and what does that look like?
Well, absolutely. I mean, right now the state plays a role in health care and how we handle Medicaid. Again, this is a social safety net for our most vulnerable. And Arizona's been called the gold standard. And Tom Betlak, who leads our access, is one of the best public servants in the country. But we do have a problem. And it's not just Obamacare. Health care has been an issue before Obamacare came. There were issues with lifetime caps and pre-existing conditions and insurance across state lines before Barack Obama was ever elected into office. I think that President Obama made a good faith effort to try to resolve some of those things, but the idea was to have people that were not uninsured, and it certainly was not successful in that pursuit. And what we've seen is an exodus of insurance providers from the state of Arizona. 10 years ago, you would have had 24 insurance providers for our 15 counties in the state of Arizona. Today, you have one insurance provider for 14 of our 15 counties. That's not choice, That's not competition. That's not customer service oriented. And I think anybody that's been to the doctor recently, especially in the individual market, and that's our entrepreneurs, our contractors, our people that have to find insurance on their own, know what a nightmare this has become, how high the premiums and deductibles have grown. So I have talked about not repeal and replace. I've talked about reform, that the real skill is in a reform. We want to have affordable and accessible health care available for our citizens in Arizona. This one-size-fits-all, top-down, centralized program written out of Washington, D.C. that has cascaded over all 50 states isn't working. Allow states and governors to have those dollars and be responsible for those programs, and Arizona will do it far better than others.
You mentioned pre-existing conditions, which has been a huge issue in this election, sort of under that healthcare umbrella. We had Attorney General Mark Brnovich in earlier this week, who's involved in one of the repeal efforts, and he was saying, you know, I'm just doing this because I find it on a legal basis to be unconstitutional. I'm pro pre-existing condition, but that's something our policymakers should be handling. So when you talk about the states having power to do what's best for them, with that particular element, do you have thoughts as to how we could handle it here to ensure that people with pre-existing conditions are covered? Oh,
sure. There's a lot of good ideas on how to handle pre-existing conditions at the state level. It's the amount of money that's washing through our healthcare system, and a system that's really been written by pharmaceutical companies, insurance companies, and hospital providers that really haven't taken into account what's most important, and that's the patient and the doctor and the nurse that serves that patient. I think if we could bring those dollars closer to home, and I'm going to tell you, if I'm governor, we're going to have a commitment to ensuring pre-existing conditions in the state of Arizona, and I think that's what you would see across the country. But I'm going to speak for the state of Arizona as the chief executive, that we could design a program where we could have those types of options for people that need it most, and then for other folks that are in different stages of their life with different flexibilities, they can be on more of a sliding scale in terms of the health insurance that they access.
Moving on to some border issues and immigration, of course, the family separations made headlines for months. Now we're dealing with the family detention situations. I know that you have been vocal on some of the situations here, specifically in Arizona. Of course, we're uniquely positioned to be dealing with this. What are your thoughts on the family detention policies, the practices that are going on right now?
Well, first I want to say that my heart breaks for these families. These are some tragic events that we have seen, and we were outspoken in our administration that we did not want to see families separated at the border. We also wanted to see what kind of care people were receiving in these facilities and shelters, and my wife Angela and I visited a shelter here at Southwest Key. We were there the day after we made the announcement, so there was no way for them to tidy up or change the way that they did things. And again, we only looked at one shelter. What we saw there was professionals, cleanliness, and a lot of care that was being provided in very difficult situations, because you saw everything from infants to teenagers late in their teenage years in that setting. We've also had some issues where they haven't lived up to that standard. So the Department of Health Services have held those facilities accountable. I think we need to look at this issue from a number of standpoints. First, what's the right thing to do? And we know that there are people that want to enter our country. I'm a big fan of our legal immigration system. I believe that it needs reform. I have talked a lot about border security, because I think because people don't believe that our border is secure, it doesn't allow us to talk about how do we improve our immigration system. That's why we've funded a border strike force in the state of Arizona, why we deployed the National Guard, why my opponent is saying things like he'll abolish ICE. And I see people like ICE as brave American men and women who are in law enforcement. And oftentimes we do have families that are trying to come across that border. But Maria, I'm going to tell you as governor, sometimes we have adults with children that they pretend are their daughters, and they are child sex traffickers or human traffickers. And what is in between them and the sex trade in this country are law enforcement individuals like ICE and the Borders and Customs Protection, along with our National Guard that's serving in assistance. It's a very difficult job, and it's very hard to determine if this young person with this adult is actually a child. So we want to see people follow the law. If they're here for asylum, there's one process. But if they're here to live here, we have an immigration system, and they're going to be returned to their country of origin.
Do you have a sort of, just continuing on with that, and asylum seekers, because of course there's currently a migrant caravan making its way here, and those who have arrived already. There are some other officials in your party who feel that the standards, or I guess the rules for who can seek asylum should be tougher. And some of them have brought up the same point you did. You know, how do we know that this is legitimately a family and not a situation like the one you described? What, I mean, specifically, you know, either policy-wise or elsewhere, what are your thoughts with asylum seekers and how to manage that situation in particular? Not people who are trying to sneak, but people who are seeking asylum.
I know what you mean. Well, the idea of asylum and that someone is fleeing a repressive government, or what we saw during many of my years before some of the changes in the Obama administration, say individuals that were coming from Cuba, people that were leaving a government, that we were going to accept asylum, certain situations around violence and danger. But I do think we're in a situation right now where people know that our southern border is wide open and unprotected in many ways. Immigration has been used as a political talking point and a way to divide and conquer at the national level. Now these are federal discussions. I know what I'm going to advocate as a border governor and as the governor of the state of Arizona. I want to see a legal immigration system that works. I want to see an asylum system that protects those that should be protected. But I think we also have to start with border security. I think if we can answer that issue first, there's all these other issues that can fall into line, from DACA to asylum to what kind of immigration system do we want. When I talk about our economy, we've got people at the entry level where we can't fill those jobs. We've got people at the highest level where they graduate from our finest universities, like the universities we have here in the state of Arizona, where they can't find those engineers. These are things that we've always solved in the past through a reasonable immigration system. That's not what we have today. It's an immigration system that's hard to understand. It's being gamed in many ways, and I'm calling on Congress to act on this. And they haven't done it. And they haven't done it under a Democratic president, and they haven't done it under a Republican president. But this is the responsibility of our federal government.
Just very quickly, you mentioned DACA and Dreamers. Do you think that a path to legal residency or citizenship should exist as part of an immigration reform package?
Yes, I've said that I don't think that children in this country pay for the sins of their parents. And a child that graduates from an Arizona high school is an Arizona student and should have the opportunities of other Arizona high school graduates.
I have to ask, your appointment of Jon Kyl to the late U.S. Senator John McCain's seat might only last through the end of this year. We're still waiting to see what his plans are. If you have to repeat that appointment process, what are you going to be looking for? And could we see Martha McSally in there, even if she doesn't win her own Senate race?
Well, first, we have 12 days until these elections are decided. And let me touch for one moment on what a difficult decision that was. When Senator McCain passed, I think we all knew that this was an Arizona and American icon. I said when people think of Arizona, they think of John McCain and the Grand Canyon. And imagining Arizona without John McCain is like picturing Arizona without the Grand Canyon. So I don't know that there was anyone that could replace Senator McCain. He was irreplaceable. But there was one name and one person that I kept coming back to, thinking who could go back to the United States Senate and get on that fast-moving merry-go-round in such a chaotic environment and do the right thing for the citizens of Arizona. So thank goodness that Jon Kyl said yes. It wasn't something he was looking to do, but it's something he had the ability to do. He's a patriot, and he's a public servant. I'm hopeful that Senator Kyle will serve the remaining 2 years of Senator McCain's cycle until there will be an election in 2020. If he chooses otherwise, it is the responsibility of the governor by law to pick the person. I'll follow the law, I'll fulfill my responsibility, and again, it would be the same parameters. I would look for the best possible person to serve the citizens of Arizona. I do think, depending on Senator Kyle's timing, that he can serve through 2020, but if you were to choose differently, you go back into a different situation where there is an onboarding, there is an acclimation, there is a new class. That's entirely different.
Has he given any indication one way or another now that he's been there?
You know, Senator Kyle, when I went to visit with him and lay out the situation and to make the ask for him to go back to Washington, D.C., I think his biggest concern at the time was how much wood he was going to chop for the winter for his cabin up in Greer.
And so not the top priority.
And he has done a phenomenal job, not only on the Kavanaugh confirmation, but on acting on Arizona water issues. And I know that he is going to Tucson, Yuma, and Flagstaff to let them know that they have a United States Senator on the case working on behalf of them. So our focus has been much more on the policy and not at all on transition.
Well, I have several more questions. There are a ton of topics we didn't get to, but we are out of time. Thank you again, Governor Ducey, for coming, sitting, talking through these points with us. This is the last of our candidate debates and interviews, but join us on Election Day. We will be having a live from the studio show that day, bringing you live election results. Again, I'm Maria Polletta with the Arizona Republic. Thanks for watching.